My name is Julie Laing. I run a food blog called Twice as Tasty, and I also teach cooking workshops, canning workshops. If there's any overarching focus to the blog, it's how to make good food all year from real basic ingredients, actual things that you want to put into your body instead of things that we've produced to make things easy and convenient sometimes. And the classes and the blog and the recipes on it, there's everything from bread making to cheese making to canning, and they asked me to come in today and talk about canning. The overarching theme that I chose for this workshop is a little less of the how-to, since we're not at a stove in a kitchen in a classroom, and a little more of getting everybody comfortable with the idea of canning. So how many of you in the room already can food? All right. And if you don't can food, is it just because you're busy? Or is it because you're kind of terrified of making your family sick?
It's both of those.
Okay.
I freeze with most things.
Yep. So it's really common for me when I talk to people who are like, oh, I've started gardening, I've started growing, I want to can things, and either they're a little too lackadaisical about it, and then they start to have poor results, and then somebody who knows a little bit about canning comes in and goes, oh my goodness, you're going to do something horrible. Or they've heard all these bad things about botulism and other microbes, and they're afraid to even start. And the reality of it is that it's really not that challenging. There's a lot of rules. A lot of the rules are rules upon rules upon rules to make sure everything stays super safe and you never have to worry. But in the end result, you know, you're dealing with food that you're growing and processing yourself, and you're going to take that care and time to do it consciously. You're going to be just fine. For Free the Seeds this year, if you've been around to some of the other workshops, you've probably heard they're focusing a lot on our community food system and the role we all play in it. And everyone in this room is already part of the community food system because we eat. And if you eat, and particularly if you eat locally, you're in the food system. If you start growing your own produce so you can eat it, then you're in the food system on another level. You're in there in the production factor. And if you start canning, you're in the processing level. Now you've got 3 factors that you're in the food system. And then at the end of it, if you're growing, you're going to start composting. You're in that sense as well. If you start canning, chances are you're going to share it. And now you're distributing. So you've got all of your factors of the local food system that you're a part of just by eating the food that you grow, can, and share around. So that's really important to me to think about when I think about what it is I want to do with my canning. We put up several hundred jars of food every year, and it's pretty much what we eat and live off of out of season. I'm a big vegetarian part of my diet, and I don't like to grow produce, or buy produce, out of season when there's mealy tomatoes and poor lettuce. And I certainly don't want to be buying produce that I'm concerned about potential contamination because it's traveled so far to get to me. So if I can take stuff that I'm either buying locally in season or growing locally and process it, then I'm golden all winter long. And there's never a shortage or issue of anything to eat in my house. And a lot of that goes back to canning, because the canning is the longest term way to store stuff. I dehydrate things, I freeze things, I ferment things. But when I'm running out of space and I need more space to put things in my tiny little 500 square foot house, it's got to be shelf stable. And that's what we're doing with the canning here. So these are all jars that have been processed in a water bath. And the 2 basic things that you're doing when you're canning something is you're using heat to kill the food spoilers, and you're using an airtight seal to keep new ones out. And by adding the right amount of heat and getting the right seal on the jar, your jar is going to be in good shape. There are a lot, people are like, oh, well, you know, I'd rather go buy a jar of pasta sauce because I'm worried that the one I can might not be safe for me and my family to eat. But the truth is that if there's canning standards, just like there are standards for commercial people, and if you know them and follow them, then you never have to worry about what's going to happen with what's coming out of this jar. So it's really more a matter of what you are comfortable with. If you're like, oh, I'm kind of nervous about canning, I don't know about doing it, and you go and you start canning some stuff, and then it just sits on your shelf and you never eat it, you haven't really achieved what you're trying to achieve from your goal. So you got to start out with, this is actually something I'm excited to do, eat, try, share, give my kids, give my grandparents, all that kind of stuff. And the best way to do that is to start by reading and looking at the standards. And they're, with the internet, it's super easy. They're all online. The USDA has a full canning guide for everything you could possibly want to process. It tells you a lot about what could go wrong, what could go right, how to do it and do it safely. And it's a great place to start learning, because if you want to do a lot of canning, then chances are you're going to need to develop some knowledge and some skills to go behind that. And that's going to be your best place to start looking. We'll talk a little bit more about other places to find information, particularly online, because the flip side, of course, of the internet is there is a lot of less than reliable information, and learning how to distinguish that is kind of important. But first, I want to talk a little bit about some of what our concerns might be when we're canning. The first thing we're dealing with here is time, and that also plays into elevation. So if you live anywhere near where we are right now, you're going to be in the 3,000 to 6,000 foot elevation level, which means every time you go to can something, you need to add extra time to your pot as you boil, because water boils at a higher temperature. It takes more time to get up there. So anytime you read any reliable recipe, they're going to have a time in there that tells you how long your jar should stay in your water bath kettle. And they'll tell you start your timer once it comes all the way up to a boil, and then leave it in for the set amount of time. And in there, they should also say with plus your altitude adjustment. So you can find it, you can go online and find out specifically what the elevation is at your address and know exactly where it falls. But the National Center for Home Food Preservation and the USDA have decided, instead of calculating, it used to be like a minute for every 1,000 feet, they're doing it in windows now. So you're 3,000 to 6,000 feet, you're gonna add 10 minutes to your canning time. And it doesn't matter whether you're canning jam, it doesn't matter whether you're canning quart jars, you're gonna add that 10 extra minutes onto whatever time you've set for your food product. The other factor that you're looking at inside the jars, actually let's backtrack a little bit. We're gonna look at the jars first. Is your jar type and size? I get a lot of people who are like, oh, I bought pasta from the store, it looks like a canning jar. You know, can I just run it, save them, and run it through the canner and all that stuff? Yes, you could, but you're going to have a lot higher chance of breakage. The jars, even the glass jars that look like mason jars that they've made commercially for commercial processing, have thinner walls in the glass. And so your best bet is to actually start out with canning jars that are marketed for canning. Ball is the company that has the near monopoly on it. There's a few other options out there, but most people are going to can in Ball jars. They're also under the brand Kerr. They've merged together. And you can buy them in all sizes. Jam jars, flatter ones, these are all 8-ounce jars. There's little half sizes if you want to do samples for people, pints, and I've got quarts for my pickling workshop later on. But they aren't larger than a quart jar. You're never going to fit in your water bath canner. You can get half-gallon jars, which are awesome for fermenting. But in your water bath canner, the biggest you're ever going to get is your quart jar. And in the canner, you've got the option to do those kind of quartz things, but you don't have to necessarily have the canning kettle. You've got the smaller jar pot too. This is just my soup stock pot. And as you can see, when I put it up against these jars, I'm going to have enough headspace, just barely enough headspace to run these. These guys, absolutely no problem. I can't fit as many jars in there, but if I'm doing a small batch of jam and I just want something quick and easy and don't want to haul out the whole canning kettle and fill up that much water, I can get away with something like this. I've got this little guy, he sits in the bottom of it. You want to keep the jars from sitting on the bottom of the kettle. And I got him because he's pretty low profile and pretty stable. I haven't yet decided if I really like him. Works better for some jar sizes than others.
Is that specifically for canning? Is that like
Yeah, I tracked down at one of the stores where I buy canning supplies, and they just happen to have it. I gave it a go. A lot of times, I will just take a bunch of rings, set them in the bottom of the jar, make a nice little mold, set the jars on top of it. If you've got enough space, you want a couple inches of water that you can keep over the top of your jars the whole time. So as long as you've got enough space for that, you're good to go. If you're doing a lot of canning though, you're gonna want a bigger kettle. This one holds 7 quart jars, and if you're gonna be going and running a bunch of batches, it's gonna be a good way to get yourself going. So your jar type matters, your jar size matters when it comes to safety. If you're going to switch up the size of jars for your recipe, you're going to need to change how much time it goes in the bath. It's logical if you think about it. Larger jar, more food, denser volume, it's going to take longer to heat to the center of that jar, which is what you're trying to do. So if I've got a recipe that calls for jam jars, and I'm like, we're going to go through this like crazy, I want to can them in pints, you're going to have to add some extra time. It's usually 5 minutes. Just to make sure you get everything heated up in there. If you go down a size, you can get away with a little less time sometimes, but you have to be aware of what it is you're putting in those jars if you're going to can smaller jars and cut your time down. The other thing on these jars, you can really use them. The canning jars are endlessly reusable. I've got some that I inherited from grandmothers and friends of grandmothers and other things that I'm still canning in. As long as they aren't, I always check them when I go to can, check the tops, make sure there aren't any chips or anything on the glass, and get them clean and they're good to go. What you can't reuse are the lids. So every time you're going to need to buy new lids to put on top of them. They've got some out there that are reusable lids. I've been playing with them. I hear hit or miss things from people about how long they work, how reliable they are. I've still got some in my collection, but ultimately I do a lot of these. Part of it too is I give away a fair amount of food, and I don't want to have to track down my fancy expensive lids in the end. So these you'll use fresh every time, but the jars are reusable and the rings are reusable. And so when you come to your canning supplies, you've got your initial investment of some of these tools, but then you've got some that you've got to stockpile now, and you're just going to keep using them up every year. Some other tools I find handy: funnel for filling, super handy, because as you can imagine, as you're going to try to pour or later something inside, this jar is pretty narrow. I want a little more space to get it in there. I'm a huge believer in having a kitchen scale. I'm a bread baker. I bake with sourdough. I do all sorts of other projects where things by weight make so much more sense than trying to judge volume. How many slices of cucumber I get compared to how many slices you get in a cup are going to be totally different, and how many slices I get from one day to the next are going to be different. So I'm a big fan of a kitchen scale. Inside the bath, jar lifter, grabs your jars, picks them up, takes them in and out. Make sure you don't burn yourself in that boiling water. Very good idea to have. And this is one I put on my blog as an essential tool: chopsticks. Wooden ones, not the enamel ones. I learned that the hard way. They start to go a little, lose little bits of chopstick inside the jar if you're not careful over time from the heat. But wood ones, gonna come in here and poke down the jars and get rid of some air bubbles. You can kind of see in this jar, this is some pasta sauce, grilled tomato pasta sauce, one of our favorites. There's some air spots in there where we didn't get it fully removed. And those are options where you're just going to have the chance to, the more air you've got left in your jar, the more chances you're going to have of too much air in there and causing things to not seal safely. So the more you can get those out, wooden chopstick is my favorite way to go.
So would you still eat that jar, or
oh yeah,
or eat it right away, or?
Nope, this jar is good. He's fully sealed. Nothing going wrong with him. He sealed just fine. It's such a dense pasta sauce that it's hard to get all of the air out of it. But what I would do is when I go to open it up is make sure that there hasn't been anything that developed in top as far as mold and things like that. He's totally safe to use. He's just got a little extra air sitting in there because he's so dense. And the more you can get rid of that, then the better your jar is going to look, the better you're going to feel about using it for sure. And then the last factor in that, and related to the same thing with the air, is the headspace. So also in this jar you can see I've got pretty good headspace around here. You usually want about 1/2 inch is your general rule of thumb. For most things, it varies depending on what you're canning, how liquid, how dense, jar size, which usually means you're going around to the bottom of this rim as you're filling. This bottom line here is going to give you about the right area. We got ours a little full, probably partially because I've got a little bit of airspace in there, probably looked just fine. But he seals up just fine, and it's all in good shape. This one is a roasted strawberry chamomile syrup. So it's liquidy, in there. It's supposed to be, and you can see, probably see a little bit better how it's got that headspace right through there, and that's really ideal. The biggest issue with your headspace is going to be how the whole process of canning works. What you're trying to do is seal your food in there, and we all think, okay, we're going to take this lid ring, we're going to crank this ring on it, we're going to put it in the water bath, it's going to seal. It's actually not quite how it works. It's a vacuum is how it works. So when you go and you fill your jar, you've got air in there, and you're trying to remove all the air out of it because you're trying to create this anaerobic environment. So you put your lid on, you put your ring on, you only put it on finger tight. You don't want to crank it down because you actually want the air that's in there when you add the lid to release itself as it heats. As it heats up, it'll push the air out of it, and then your seal will come down, it'll make that lovely popping noise that happens, and now your jar's fully sealed, and it's safe to sit there for as long as you need it to. It's advisable to eat your canned goods within a year because they're going to taste best, but they certainly will last longer in the jar as long as it seals safely. I've got some up here. Found one, the Lost Soldier from 2015, sitting back on my shelf. Some of these were, a lot of these were last year's. Some of these were the years before. So these jars, they've sealed, they've got all of their coverage. Your lid otherwise, it's going to make that popping noise. And you want it to pop down and release its vacuum. So yeah, so when you tighten them on, finger tight is all you need to do because you're trying to get that vacuum out. Once you get your vacuum sealed, then you've sealed out anything that's going to potentially try to move in there and cause damage, and your jar is safe and good to go.
Do you measure the headspace? I mean, how accurate do you need to be with the headspace? I feel like I'm very random.
Nope, I get you. I don't measure, I don't sit there and take out a ruler or anything like that and do that. I know that where the bottom line of this jar is about where I want to hit. My canning partner will tell you I'm notorious for overfilling and trying to cram that much more in there. The real risk you run if you overfill is that stuff's going to come out in your canner. And so if you've ever overfilled a canning jar and you open up your canner and you find things kind of floating around in there, chances are it's come out from the top because you had too much inside. And that creates a problem with your vacuum because now you've got debris around your ring, you're not going to get your jar to seal. And so that's really where you're starting with your headspace. The other end of the headspace is to have too much. If you're pressure canning, you don't necessarily need all that liquid in, but when you're water bath canning, you're trying to push all that air out. So if you only half fill your jar and you boil it in jam for 10 minutes, then 15 minutes with our altitude adjustment, so 5 minutes for your jam jar, 15 with our altitude, and you haven't moved all that air out yet because those numbers are based on having just that much air on top. And now you do run the risk of having too much air trapped inside there and causing you issues. So, but yeah, as far as how exact and scientific you have to be about it, do what's going to feel comfortable, and do it as a learning process. Realize that, okay, I overfilled that jar, and I've always only filled them this far, but now I'm canning something different, and it's going to fill differently. You learn as you go along, and you check with it. If your jar seals, then you're good to go, and you were successful. If your jar doesn't seal, then you stick it in the fridge, you eat it right away because you've just processed it, you're in good shape. You can reprocess them. They have instructions for that on the USDA does and things on their canning sites. You take it out, you heat it up again, you do it again. You have to do it within a real limited window. I think they're at 24 hours to reprocess jars. But in my experience, jar failures where they don't seal, I might get a jar from a batch of, however many batches I do over a season. I might get 3 or 4 that wouldn't seal over the course of an entire season, and I'm doing hundreds of jars. So I just stick them in the fridge and we eat them first thing.
Are they sealing while they're in water, or do they seal after you take them out? Because I've experienced that where I hear the pop after.
Yep, they're going to seal after.
Okay,
Yep,
cool.
so yeah, while they're in the water, they've still got air, they've still got vacuum and things flowing along. It's when they hit that temperature change, they come out of the water, that's when they're going to seal. And depending on what you're canning, the size of the jar, how dense the volume is inside of it, that could be as soon as you pull it out of the canner. I can little sample jars of jams to give people, and they'll pop as I'm lifting them free. Or if you're doing a quartz, they might sit there for 20, 30 minutes before you start to hear the popping. What I usually do is I let them cool completely before I make the judgment of whether they've sealed or not. And a lot of times that means I'm letting them sit overnight and I'm checking them the next day. And at that point, if I'm pressing down and I'm finding they haven't sealed, that's when I have to go and stash them into the fridge. So, yeah. So I'm gonna have you guys just shoot me some questions, and we'll come from here. If we got a lot, I could talk about canning all day, to be honest. And I've got a lot of information about the science behind it, and some of the pH factors and the acidity and things like that. I'm teaching a pickling workshop this afternoon. We're going to talk about that a lot more. But more importantly, I want to make sure we're answering some of the questions that you guys have, so we get you a little more comfortable with canning.
So besides fruit, pickles, or tomatoes, is that like carrots or something that you have there? Are they pickled?
Yep. These are pickled carrots.
Do you can water bath, not pressure? Do you can vegetables that are not pickled?
No.
Okay.
So, and here's where we're talking about our pH and our acidity. So, to safely can in a water bath, you have to get the acidity of a vegetable to a level where it's going to stay in this anaerobic environment and everything's going to be nice and awesome. And the magic number is 4.6 pH. So it's kind of confusing because you've got the higher your pH number and the lower your acidity, it's the opposite of what everybody thinks. And I've got a fabulous way to say that written down here somewhere. So what we're talking about is with your pH levels. Oh, that's in for the pickling workshop, never mind. So yeah, so what you're looking for is your high acid foods. So your pH number, the magic line they call, is 4.6. If you have a number below that, then you're safe, you're good to go, because you have enough acidity in the jar, which is your fruits and it's mostly the fruits actually that are going to be naturally below that level where they're going to be safe. Things that you have to worry about are the things that are low in acid, which are almost all your vegetables, a lot of your aromatics, some of your fruits, things like melons. A lot of the melons are low acidity. So at that point, you have to either add acidity into it if you're going to do it in a boiling water bath, or you have to find another way to process it, whether that's through a pressure canner, if you're going to can it, through dehydrating, through fermenting, which is another acidification process. But if you want to run it through a boiling water bath, you got to make sure that pH is 4.6 or below. So the one that everybody is always concerned about are tomatoes. Where are tomatoes on the acidity scale? And if you've been around some of the other classes, you've probably heard that we've been changing the structure of the produce we eat over the years. And we've made tomatoes over the years less acidic. So now they're on this cusp level where you never quite know if your tomato is going to be acidic enough, because it's in that range right around 4.6. So they always recommend that if you're going to water bath canned tomatoes, you add some acid. For pasta sauce, I'm adding a couple of teaspoons of lemon juice to the jar. I just float it straight into the jar. I don't have to worry about whether this tomato or that tomato. I'm usually using blended tomatoes. What the acidity of each individual one in was, we're just adding it straight to the jar. Salsas, chutneys, things like that. I'm going to add a little bit more acidity, not necessarily because I need it for safety, but that's the flavor I'm going for. And then you get to the full-on pickles where you're adding quite a bit of acidity, and that's where I start to be safe with things like my carrots, my cucumbers, and stuff like that, to put them through the boiling water bath. So the other factor to think about too when you're canning those things is, this is pasta sauce. Can you imagine what else is in this jar besides tomatoes? Vegetables. Onion, garlic, lots of things that are low in acid. So I've changed my pH from just whatever the tomato was to whatever the combination of all the ingredients is.
So are you measuring your pH and your acidity, or are you just, on experience, guessing how much lemon juice you need to add?
I'm not measuring my pH is the first part of the question. There are ways you can do it. The technology is getting better. The pH strips have never been very reliable. They've got digital readers now, which are semi-reliable, but unless you're going to start doing something commercially where you're processing in enough volume that you know the tomato you grew this season has the same pH as the tomato you grew last season, it's kind of hard to get those exact numbers. So where I work from is I use recipes that are tested, and then because I'm adapting my own recipes based off of that, I'm using all the science and information I can get my hands on to tell me that I'm well within a safety range. And it's all out there. So it's a matter of how much you really want to learn about it, how much you want to geek out on it, versus how much you want to just be able to say, you know, I just grew something, I just want to be able to put it in a jar and eat it later. So my recommendations for people is to think about it in terms of what your approach is. If you're like, I want it to be easy, I want it to be simple, I don't want to have to know exactly what's going on in the recipe, follow a tested recipe. Those are going to be ones that come from the USDA, they're going to come from the National Center for Food Preservation, they're going to come from some of the big name canning books. Ball Company does its own line of canning books, they're going to be testing all that stuff. Follow the tested recipes, and when I say follow, I do mean follow. As soon as you start to alter something in your canning recipe, you've started to play with the acidity level. And if you don't know what you're altering and how it's going to change your jar, then you're not necessarily going to be able to say, I'm confident 100% in what I just put into this canning jar. And that's your goal. You want to be 100% confident with what you just put in there. So if you're like, I just want to get it going, try it, follow those recipes, follow them verbatim, don't deviate with them, and see what you come up with. If you want to move to the next level, then you're like, okay, I really like canned pickles, but I don't like this flavor or that flavor or whatever they're doing here. Do I have to do it? You go online, you find a recipe that alters it and is more to your liking. Now you need to come up with the knowledge that's going to say, okay, am I looking at a recipe that I can trust? And that is one of the biggest factors when you're looking at how to follow and decide if you've got a trusted recipe. And I'm standing in front of you as someone who puts up recipes on her blog that I've adapted from a tested recipe. And I trust them. I trust them enough that I share them with everyone. But how do you know to trust me? Some of the things that you read online can be clues into how to trust a recipe that you're looking at, so you know it's safe. The first thing is make sure it's meant for canning. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of pasta sauce recipes out there, but if they're not designed to be run through a water bath canner, then chances are they don't have as much acidity, because how many of you actually put lemon juice into every pasta sauce you make for your evening meal, right? So you need to make sure you're looking at a recipe that is designed for canning. It should say that it can go safely into a water bath canner. Even if it says that, you want to look at it and go, okay, does this person, do I really trust that they're telling me what goes in it? They should tell you what you need to add in terms of acidity, and they should give you a percentage. So if you're looking at a canning recipe and you're doing something where you're adding acid, it should tell you you need to add 5% acidity, vinegar, lemon juice, whatever it is. They should be real specific about that, because if most of us are looking at whatever is on the shelf for commercial vinegars, for a long time they had to meet a standard of 5% acidity, but it's not always the case these days. Rice vinegar is usually lower, it's usually 4.3%. So if you're canning with a recipe and they're specifying rice vinegar, they should tell you it's a 4.3% rice vinegar, and they should have done the math for you to make that calculation ratio that's safe in there. Some of the wine vinegars have a higher percentage. You can always add a higher percentage and you'll be safe. It might change your flavor in there. But I'm also starting to see some where they're dropping to like 4.5% for some. So when you go and you get your bottle of vinegar, it should say right on it, percentage of acidity inside there. That's what they've diluted it down to. I'm going to talk a bit about more of that in the pickling class this afternoon. But it should say right on there. If it doesn't say, then chances are you're looking at a real cheap vinegar or something that they've lost it somewhere in the fine print. If you're making your own vinegars at home, unless you're testing them, you won't know your acidity. And that is one point where I'd recommend either using your homemade hard work vinegars for fresh things and canning with vinegars that have been tested, or really getting after the testing yourself, because you just won't know. Those vinegars are constantly changing. Other things to look at in canning recipes is, I just ran into this last week. Someone was questioning a recipe they made, said it was for canning, said it was all good to go. It was on not a canning site, but on a pretty dominant food site. And she's like, I'm just not sure. I didn't want to add this much acid because I didn't want to add bottled lemon juice. And, we're all like, okay, you do need to add that. But then looking closer at the recipe, it called for a whole lot of oil, which was something that I was like, if I'm making salsa and stuff on the stovetop, yeah, I'm going to be sauteing and doing things up in oil. But adding this much oil into a jar, oil totally affects your density, your acidity, and things. You very rarely are using much of it at canning. They used to say, don't use it at all. So it's one of those things where I'm like, you're adding half a cup of oil to this batch? That kind of triggers my brain cells that maybe this isn't a recipe that's really designed for canning, even if they're purporting that it is. Other things to look at are that there's really specific about processing time, jar size, and altitude adjustment. Those are things that should be in any reliable canning recipe, because all of us live in different areas, and what I process here versus what my sister processes in Bellingham, Washington, versus what my friend does up in upstate New York, and versus my friends who are in the high plains of Colorado. It's all of those factors are going to need to be adjusted based on where you live. So when you look at a canning recipe, it should have all that information in there. It doesn't have to be a huge, big, long explanation. You go to my blog, you'll find I've got some basic pages that I link to about a lot of this stuff. And then in each recipe, I'm like, this is your jar size, this is your processing time, add your altitude adjustment. You click the link, you find your altitude adjustment, you add it. So I don't have to repeat that in every single recipe. It's real succinct, but it's all there. And so the idea is that as you start canning more, you're just going to be able to need those pieces of information. But you're going to want them in there. If they say, oh, you can totally can this safely, but they don't tell you how long or things like that, then you start to question whether or not they've really done their due diligence on there. So.
What about lemon juice? Is that pretty standard on its acidity?
Yeah, so bottled lemon juice, they've got a standard for. And there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about using fresh lemon juice versus bottled, because bottled's got some preservatives and things like that, and some people are having reactions to some of the preservatives in them, so they're trying to avoid them. For the longest time, everybody said you can't trust the acidity of fresh lemons because it's a piece of produce. It's going to change all the time. What they're starting to realize is that they really don't change that much. Linda Zedrich, who is one of the canning gurus out there, she's been doing it for a long time, and canning and fermenting and things like that. She's got a great article on her blog where they went and they tested the bottled lemon juice versus a bunch of different lemons. They talked to a bunch of people at the extension services and the research centers, and they're like, really, they're all within the range, which is something else you have to think of whenever you look at a published list of a pH of a particular piece of produce. It's going to have a range, because they can't nail a pinpoint number, because it's going to change versus, based on your climate, your conditions, the growing season, stuff like that. So what they've been found with lemon juice is a lot of it's well within the range, and so people are starting to use that and use the fresh lemon for their canning processes as well. The one exception to lemons, which I always forget to add because we live here and we don't usually buy them, are Meyer lemons. If you've ever heard of them, they're actually not a true lemon. They're a cross of a lemon and I believe a tangerine. And so their acidity isn't going to be high enough to run the same process as your standard lemon. They're fancy, they're gourmet. You think you're doing the right thing by throwing it in your canning jar, but the pH on it isn't the same level, so you'd have to adjust for that. What else we got?
I have a question. I have some canned relish and pickles
Mhm.
from a friend of mine who passed away about 10 years, almost 10 years ago.
Mhm.
Are they edible? I mean, the seal hasn't
That's a good
popped.
question. If the seal hasn't popped,
Mhm.
chances are they're still edible. If the seal is on there and hasn't popped, then you're probably in good shape. The things that you don't know is if they were in her possession most of that time, is how they were treated, transported, stored. They mostly might not taste very good because they could have been exposed to light and things like that where it just dulled the flavor.
Mhm.
The chances of them being unsafe to eat are certainly far lower than, the time frame isn't going to affect that so much because the jar is sealed. But you might pop it open and find that what's inside isn't really very tasty. So, yep, I had a couple that I salvaged from the back of my parents' canning cupboard when they were moving, and you could even just see inside the jar that things had kind of solidified a little bit. And you're like, yeah, that's just gonna go straight out the door. But pop them open, see what happens. So the big scare and the boogeyman of home canning and things like that is botulism. You can't see it, you can't taste it. It is something to be serious about because it can kill you. But the reality of it is that the chances of it killing you are super slim. I've got some stats, I've got some paperwork up here with some full-on numbers, and we'll talk about it later this afternoon. But the CDC has their latest report. There were 4 nationwide cases of foodborne illness from home canning. And all of those were from people who weren't canning properly. They were trying to do potatoes in a boiling water bath without any added acidity. But 4 cases nationwide. And this is in comparison to, let's see, what are my numbers for that? I think nationwide, the USDA found that, there are my numbers. Yep, so yeah, 4 cases, 2016 was their latest report. That's in comparison to an annual estimate of 48 million people who are getting sick from E. coli, salmonella, other cooties, usually from commercially grown processed foods. They also say 1 in 5 people can, 1 in 6 people are getting sick from the commercial foods. So if you think about your risk and your numbers, it's serious. You want to take it seriously. You want to do it safely. You want to use clean equipment and produce you trust, and do things like, I've got a 10-year-old jar. Is it worth opening it and trusting it, especially if I didn't can it myself? Those are questions that you want to take seriously and ask yourself. But the reality of it is, if you do it properly and you follow the directions, you're good to go. The other thing you can find inside your canning jars sometimes is going to be things that you can see. If it smells bad, if there's mold on it, those are all things, something didn't seal right, something didn't work right. Toss the jar for sure. You don't want to mess with trying to scrape off that stuff and eat it because you don't know exactly what happened there with your long shelf stable goods. And I do a lot of really low sugar canning, particularly with my fruits and my jams and things like that. So they won't have as long of a shelf life in the fridge. The jar is fine, the jar is great, it's been on the shelf a year or 2, and we open it up, everything looks golden, but I stick it in the fridge and it'll spoil faster, particularly than a commercial jar. You can keep a commercial jar of jam for months and months. And my home canned ones might last a couple weeks, and that's usually because I haven't put as much sugar in there. Sugar is part of one of the preservatives that really takes effect once you open your jar.
Are you using pectin in your jams?
Sometimes I use pectin, and sometimes I don't. I do a lot of jams where I'm separating out. This is one of them here. I've got the roasted strawberry syrup. I macerate the fruit and roast the fruit and macerate it, so I separate out the liquid and the fruit. And now I'm canning more of the solids. It's technically not a jam, more of a fruit spread. But for me, I don't have to cook that down as long. I don't have to boil it as long. And now I've got 2 products. I've got syrup and I've got jam coming out of the same jar. So I do that a lot. And then I don't have to add all that extra sugar to try to get everything to set and activate the pectin. When I do use pectin, I use Pomona's. These guys here. love what they're doing with their stuff. You can alter the recipe to use little to almost no sugar. I swear I'm not a promoter for them. But they're processing the pectin in a different way. So it's a citrus-based pectin, and you activate it with calcium. They've got 2 separate packets in here. Oh, this one's been in use, so it's missing a calcium packet. So this is the rest of the pectin packet. And the calcium went into a jar with water that's probably still sitting in the back of my fridge from last canning season. And because it's citrus activated, you don't need all of that sugar in there to get it to operate correctly. So they're talking about low sugar recipes that are using as little as half a cup of sugar, to all fruit recipes where they're doing fruit juice and there's no added sugar. And they're getting it set with the citrus pectin. So they come with the great little instruction sheet inside, like all of them do, that'll tell you how to walk through the process and follow that. But I prefer them to like the other brands that are doing low, no sugar pectins, because a lot of times they're adding sucrose or fructose, or they're adding something in there. They want you to add Splenda, things like that. And I really am, if I'm gonna put sugar in something, I'm gonna put sugar in something. So if I want it sweet, that's how it's gonna go. So I prefer this option, and I've had great success with it. You don't have to stick to the low batch size, particularly if you're not trying to get a super dense, thick jam. It's a little harder with things like jellies and stuff. A lot of times I'm doing a whole fruit there. The other options for pectin so a lot of your fruits are high in acid, but they're going to be low in pectin. Some of them are high in both. You take your marmalades, your kumquats, your things like that. They're through the roof. But you can also add fruit and natural fruit pectins in there, whether you separate it out or whether a lot of times I'm making jam and you're adding fresh apple into it, and that's helping to set your pectin. I do see this one here, I didn't bring one of those. This is a Italian plum apple chutney, so it doesn't have any added pectin to it. You can see it's quite dense, and that's all from the cooking down time. It cooked down for a long time on this one, and also with the apple in there, I'm getting a little bit of that pectin density. I don't need to add a powdered version of anything.
Is the pressure canner the same as the pressure cooker? Or
Nope. If you're going to go the pressure canning route, you really do want to get a canner that's registered for pressure canning. They are tested and certified. It's Underwriter Laboratories who does that. And the kettle, for one thing, it should be big. But it should have a UL symbol on it, their little logo and symbol that says it's been tested by them. Pressure cookers are great if you're going to do beans or dinners or things like that, but they actually don't get up to the same temperatures as the canning kettles and canning pressure canners. And what you're looking for with pressure canning is you've taken out the acidity that's helping to make everything food safe and keep your cooties out. Now you're just relying on heat. You want to kill all of the nasties, you got to get that thing up over 240 degrees, which is pretty hot. So your pressure cookers, they aren't built for that. They aren't going to get you up to that temperature, and besides being the size of the shoes and things like that. I personally don't do any pressure canning, and it has nothing to do with, some people are a little concerned and scared about, it's the big thing steaming all over the world. I grew up around it, so I'm comfortable with it. But the main reason I don't do it is I don't eat a lot of meat. And to my mind, that's really your advantage of pressure canning. If I lived up in Alaska and I had access to a lot of salmon, I'd be all over pressure canning. But I'm a vinegar fan, I'm a fermented foods fan, so I'd rather have my cucumbers pickled, my snap beans pickled and crispy than soft, gooey pressure can.
So you pickle everything, well, not everything, but I mean,
I pickle
like
a lot of
your beans,
things.
your beans.
Yep.
So they're pickly versus just like a bean off of
Yep. So yeah, if you think about it, you eat your fresh beans, you're fresh right off the plant or freshly
Right.
cooked. They've got a certain flavor to them. You eat beans that have been canned in a pressure canner, and they're soft and kind of mushy or commercially canned, and they've lost a lot of that flavor that's that's come out of them through that heat. You pickle the beans, either, I do them both in a water bath canner with vinegar, and I also do fermented pickled beans, which are a whole nother lovely flavor profile. I'll be talking about that this afternoon. But you go and you pickle them. If I'm canning them in the pressure canner, I'm gonna get that vinegar flavor in them for sure. But they're only in the canner for, I think it's 15 minutes at our altitude. And they're bright, they're crisp, they're crunchy.
Mushy.
They're not mushy. If you wanna pickle them, you have to add enough acidity to get it to be safe.
Right.
So you don't want to cut back if you're like, oh, I'm kind of on the cusp of whether or not I like pickles. You don't want to cut back. I have had people who've pickled and then they rinse them before they eat them if they don't like as much vinegar. That's how they're starting to get their kids to eat them sometimes. Yeah.
She doesn't like pickles.
Yeah, yeah. So, and my best advice for that is if you're going to start playing with, okay, I want to start doing it at home, but I don't know if I'm going to like it, do a refrigerator jar. The workshop I'm doing this afternoon on pickling, we're going to talk about quick pickles that you can make literally while you're making dinner, pickles that go in the refrigerator, ones that you process, and ones that you ferment. And if you're like, I don't know if I'm going to like the pickles, do a jar in the refrigerator. You only need a jar's worth of produce. You can do it at the same ratios that you would use in your canner, so you know whether you're going to like it. Let them sit in the fridge a few days, see what you think.
So could you, like a veggie stew or
Yeah.
veggie chili, could you water bath can that if you add enough acidity to it? Or would you just say that's just really pressure?
A lot of the stews and soups and things, they are pressure canning, mostly because if you think about it, the things that you're going to put acidity into, you're going to taste that. I can a recipe that's that I got from somebody else that's technically considered a relish. I use it as a pasta sauce, but I can taste the vinegar in there. I like the vinegar, I don't mind it, but somebody who's like, oh, this is kind of an interesting pasta sauce, they would probably think so, because you're going to taste it. And it's kind of the same with your soups and things like that, is you got to add enough acidity in there, it's going to add that flavor. You're also doing a whole bunch of different produce in the same jar. So when you start getting into that category of I'm putting a lot of different things in a jar and I'm not adding enough acid to make, the most low acid food safe, then you got to start following a recipe where you know you're going to hit those targets, because everything's going to have a different pH level. So that being said, there are recipes out there. There's some that they've tested that they are doing, and some are in water bath and some are in soups. If you're doing adding any meat into it, definitely got to be pressure canned, or you add it afterwards. I'm a huge fan of canning up the basic thing and then using that to alter my recipe when I go to make a meal. I'll can up this pasta sauce and I'll be like, oh, I want to add some mushrooms, I want to add some shrimp, I want to add, do it with some cheese. You add all that stuff after you've opened the jar. You're going to heat the jar up anyway to throw it on your food, so the few extra minutes you spend to add those low acid things in there are certainly fine. The best source I know of right now for soups and stews and things that are going in the canning jar is actually the Ball Company. They used to be pretty boring in their recipes. They've gotten a little more creative in recent years. Their new Ball canning book came out a couple of years ago, and they've got a bunch of soups and things in there, and I don't remember how many are pressure canned versus done in your water bath, but they'll have some recipes that are worth playing with. So. What else we got? We got a few more minutes. Any other questions?
I guess on the sugar ones,
Mhm.
I'm assuming that it also needs to be 4.6 pH or below, even if it's a syrupy thing.
Yep.
So you're saying the sugar doesn't really preserve it until don't get the preservative nature of it until you're in the fridge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so adding sugar into canning, I'm still learning some about the science behind this, because for the longest time I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, okay, if I have to have the acidity to make my jar safe, why in the world do I need the sugar? And why do I have to have so much sugar? You look at canning recipes that are full sugar recipes, they've got more sugar than fruit by volume in that thing. And I love really fruit-forward jams and things. That's why I started working with Pomona's pectin. What I've realized is that there are several factors at play, of course, because that's how it always works in science. It can't just be easy and simple. And the biggest factor of the sugar is that it's what's going to do the preserving once you open the jar. It's going to keep that jar in your refrigerator longer. But it still has an effect in the canning because the sugar is helping to shift the water content and the water volume. So it's the same thing with salt when you're fermenting and you're pickling. You think a cucumber is a good example. It's easier to visualize than fruit. But you think about a cucumber, it's got a lot of water in there. You can practically wring one of those things out when you've got one that's overripe. And when you put the salt or the sugar, it starts to infiltrate in there. It starts to kick the water out. Now you're going to have less of a chance for microbes and things to grow in there because they want that water content. So it is playing a role in your canning process, but your safety factor really still is your acid. And almost all of your fruits are going to be in that high acid zone where you don't have to worry about it. The other thing the sugar is going to do, though, is interact with that pectin and get those bonds to form to dense it up. So if I'm making a syrup and I'm looking for it to be more liquidy, then I'm not looking for the pectin set that's in the fruit solids. I can extract out all that fruit and make it work. If I want to make this jelly, I add a lot more sugar in there and probably some pectin to get it to actually gel and set up and form a solid body. So, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I think that's what I got to say on that. What else we got? So I can throw some other stuff at you here for sure. The one thing I did want to make sure, and I want to wait to talk about till the end, get you guys out the door, is rules of canning. There's books, there's volumes, there's lots of things out there. I personally have 3 main rules that have nothing to do with the science and the behind the sense, in the sense that, I've got to memorize these and follow a specific direction. These are the things that I think are going to be crucial to either getting you started canning or to getting you canning better. The first one, get comfortable. And that means something different to everybody. Maybe that means that you need to do a lot of reading and research and get geeky about it like I do, so that you know what's going on in every single jar. Maybe it means that you need to have somebody actually show you hands-on. I know a lot of people who are like, I've read the recipes, it looks like I can do it, but I'm still nervous. If you're still nervous, take a class, do a workshop. I teach canning workshops. I come to your home, I teach you and your friends. We do it in your kitchen with your equipment and everything. They teach canning workshops here at the college, so you don't have to gather people and you can just sign up individually and do that. We unfortunately don't have a very good food extension service here in the Valley as far as classes and workshops and things, but you can certainly call and the MSU extension get information and stuff answered there. But get in front of somebody in person and do it if you're nervous about it still. Or find some friends and people you know who are experienced doing it and say, hey, can I come and can with you? You'll be surprised at how many people have got this in their arsenal of tools that you don't know about. So getting comfortable, I think, is one of the biggest things you can possibly do on whatever level. The second thing is take responsibility for it. You're talking about food doesn't want to sit like this. This isn't its natural preferred form of life. It's already past its prime. We're altering it so we can keep it this way for our benefit. It does nothing for the produce. So learn what you can about it. Start doing it. By all means, get out there, get comfortable, do it, and then ask all the questions that you have. And don't be afraid. There's no such thing as a stupid question about canning. Absolutely not. So don't be afraid to ask. If you've got it, somebody else has already had it before. And then take that information and add it to your arsenal. I think people make the mistake of thinking that, because it's in the recipe and it's been tested and I'm all good to go, then boom, I'm done. And you are. You've canned a great jar of food, but now you want to can something else. You got to learn what the difference is in there. And you certainly have to learn that what I do for dinner doesn't necessarily go make fresh for a dinner for a sauce or a salsa or something, isn't necessarily going to fit inside my canning jar. And why? The more you know about it, then you go back to number one, the more comfortable you're going to be. The third thing, I think, is if you are in doubt, toss it. I'm a huge a huge advocate of, oh my goodness, I made this, I put the energy into it. I don't want to throw it out, but if you doubt it, throw it away. If it's sat on your shelf for 10 years or somebody else's shelf for 10 years, open it up, look at it. I'd be curious. I want to know what it looks like.
Well, I have opened.
Yep. But, you know, if you aren't 100% comfortable with it, don't be afraid to throw it out. You've spent some time, you've spent some money, but think of it as the learning process. And the reality of it is if until you're 100% comfortable with what you've put on your shelf, it's just going to sit there and it's not going to improve. It's not going to improve in flavor or texture or anything like that. And you're certainly not going to feel more comfortable with it the longer you let it sit there. So clean out your jar, give it a toss, do it again.
Save the jar.
Save the jar, yes, always save the jar. They have myriad uses. So, I think we've got a few minutes left if anybody has any more questions.
Well, is your blog easy to find, just twice?
Oh, yes, I meant to do that at the beginning. Yes, my blog is easy to find. It's twiceastasty.com. Well, like I said, there's a pile of recipes on there, including canning recipes. I am not a scientist. I am not fully commercially testing all of my recipes, but I have fully researched them and 100% confident in putting them out there. And there's a lot of stuff that's not canning on there as well. It's fun to play and cook with. My most recent recipes were for some homemade harissa, some bean soups, and some chickpea and lentil snacks, bacon snacks. And this next month I'm going to have some recipes up for, I might go with some gingerbread pancakes, some garlic soup, and I think gnocchi before the end of the month. Yeah, well, thank you guys all for coming.
Is boiling the jars before you fill them, if you've washed them really thoroughly in hot water, is boiling the jars still very important?
The sanitizing thing, people are on the fence about. The USDA and the National Center for Food Preservation will tell you you should still boil the jars. I've found that because I have really hard water at my house.
Yes, and I live on a well and
content.
it's so full of iron that the
Yeah.
water's cloudy in there. So I either have to buy water to fill the canner, or
Yeah.
so sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to boil the jars, I just washed them.
Yep, and I've got the same thing. And so a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm putting them into the canner and letting them go for a few minutes. It's 10 minutes is what it takes to get them sterilized at the boiling temperature. And I'm often shortchanging that because I am getting that debris in there. The other thing you can put in there, and I wrote down how much somewhere, is, yeah, it's your water bath. They say half a teaspoon of distilled vinegar. Add it to the bath, and it'll help to keep the exteriors of the jars clean. I usually do a little bit more than that because I got a lot of minerals in my water. But I add a little vinegar to the water, and that'll help with the exterior wash for sure. Which, on that note, distilled vinegar is about the only thing I use it for in cleaning. If you're going to can, highly recommend going with something besides distilled cider, wine vinegar, those kind of things. Just flavor-wise, you're going to get a much better product. Yeah.
So white vinegar and distilled vinegar are two different things.
They're the same thing. White and distilled, same thing. I
Okay.
use them for cleaning. That's about it.
But use cider vinegars for
Cider vinegar, I use a lot of wine vinegar.
wine.
White wine vinegar for things that I'm canning. These are fridge pickles, onions. They got red wine vinegar. They run real bright, pretty red onion jar. So I'm going to be talking more about that this afternoon if you're curious about one of those things too. Well, thank you guys so much for coming.
I'm gonna try it.